Today, our rewarding conversation is with Clare Morgan. Clare leads the people management function as business partner with the local government and social care Ombudsman. Clare, thank you for your time.
You're
I know,
welcome.
I know you have a very busy schedule, so it's great to have a chance to chat. I thought just to get the conversation going, we could talk a little bit about what it was that attracted you to public service, and in particular a specialist role, in particular with human resource management.
Yes, of course. So I had started my career actually in something completely different in sales and accounts, and I saw a role come up in public service. So it was with a police training centre, and the role was HR. And I looked at it and I thought, this looks like something that really certainly appealed to me. It was about supporting, it was about nurturing, it was about putting processes in place. So I applied and I was offered the opportunity as an admin officer to go into the role. And over the last over 20 years, I've worked in human resources, going through the different roles, doing the whole employee life cycle, and working in public service. I spent 4 years at the police training centre, and then I moved on to a local council, and actually looking at the value of what public service gives, and a number of people in those organisations and really challenging times working there for the good of the borough or the county that they work in, and knowing that you don't always get the reward back. There's certainly from an ER perspective, from pay perspective, you don't always get that back, but you're often doing tough roles. So what really attracted me to it was I was there to support people and support people in those roles and get the best out of them so they could get the best out of their role, even though the context wasn't always the most, I would say supportive in some ways because it was so challenging. So what attracted me to the LGSCO is I'd worked in local authority for such a length of time. I understood the services, and again, coming into a HRBP role, the element of still supporting managers, but also looking at the strategic focus of what can we do to move the workforce, move the organisation forward, and ensure that we have the right resources to support that.
Yeah, and taking a view across a national organizational landscape compared with one that is more specifically regional or local adds an extra dimension, doesn't it, to trying to support people, particularly across multiple locations.
It does, it does. And whilst in local authority, there's different locations, but in a very small scale. Yes, working across 3 locations, having very much a remote management, remote business style approach, enabled me to focus on those communication skills, focus on all that should be HR in terms of supporting everybody. We've moved into an agile world, so starting a new role in a HR focus in an agile world was very different, having spent 18 years in my previous organisation. But looking at that span and ensuring that everybody receives the same HR support and service, be it that managers and employees as well, which was a really important focus for me.
Mm. I know the concept of agile working has become part of the lexicon. For anybody that hasn't come across it, could you just say a little bit more to clarify what we mean when we talk about an agile world?
Yes, of course. Agile working is the hybrid model around working from both the office or the organization, workplace, wherever that may be, and working from home. So many organizations have moved to an agile workforce, hybrid working, which means that they attend the office, and some organizations have been quite prescriptive around the time that they must attend the office, and other organizations have been more set in terms of what works for the organization. Here at the LGSCO, we very much focused on not being so prescriptive, but making sure that the value of when we come together is really, really there. So it's about collaboration, it's about working together when it's right, but also allowing our employees to make that choice where the right place for them is at the right time.
Mm. In a way, you could argue that's part of what might be labelled the total rewards approach. There's a reward in people feeling that sense of autonomy and capacity to choose how they work as well as what they're doing.
You're absolutely right, Stephen. And something we've developed recently is our career site on our website. And one of the attractive offers to our prospective employees is that we don't ask people to come in for that prescriptive time. We felt that actually, why would we, at this point in time, set an arbitrary number of days that needed to come in? And we found that we're getting a number of people applying, saying this is what really attracted them to apply for the role.
Oh, it's really good. And obviously, from a managerial point of view, you've got to be prepared to let go some control. You know, I can remember years and years ago, Charles Handy, that organization theorist, talking about going into a newsroom and people saying that they'd like to work autonomously, but and then pointing to the big guy in the end office, but he won't let me. And managers have got to be prepared to trust their people if they're going to work in that way.
They have, and I think a number of organisations have done work with their teams as we have in terms of how do we manage in an agile way? What does that mean? What does that look like? And also knowing when the time and space is there to be together. But actually what we found over time is having a Teams call or a Zoom call, as we are doing now, is as valuable as meeting face to face at different times, depending on travel and how that person feels. And the focus is very much on the value of the conversation rather than where it takes place. So I think it's right. It's certainly, like you say, it's changed the way that managers manage in certain ways, but it's really focusing on that conversation. One part is listening, actually, so and reading body language, but it's certainly become more of the model that we're used to. And also we work in an organisation where we share office space with others, and we notice that others are doing that very much too.
Interesting point, as you say, reading body language. We're social beings. We're used to doing that when we're in the same space, but having to develop our skills to do so virtually, that whether you're a manager to an employee or a colleague, or indeed if you're dealing with a customer, quite an important skill to develop these days.
Yes, definitely, and really focus on how that, because also you want it to be natural, but I think we've had work and that focus on what does that look like, not when you're in the space together. It can be done very well, and on the flip, it can't be. If you're very much restricted to time and you're always worrying about what's the next one, and also concentration. We found that over time, not just here, but in working in a hybrid model, it's very easy to get wrapped up in other things. You and I could be talking now and my emails could be pinging off and I could be looking at other things, and that wouldn't happen if we were talking face to face. So we have to consider, certainly in a learning environment, so where training and learning and coaching, all of that going on, we just need to make sure that we really are focusing on that person and having that one-to-one conversation if you're not in the room.
Yeah, as you say, a whole different skill, and indeed something then for thinking about performance management, appraisals, ongoing development related to those things. It's we genuinely are working in a whole different world. Before we move the conversation on, you said at the top that you'd started out in sales. Do you think that was useful in terms of becoming a people management leader?
I think it was. I think it developed my skill around customer service. And actually, what people sometimes forget is the HR, our employees and our managers are my customers. I need to ensure that they feel that they're given the opportunity to say what they need. So I think that skill set around sales and understanding what the need is, what and um, how to give that has been really important. And I also feel it's given me the skill set to be to have good communication. And I think that's really important in a HR role.
Yes, yes. At the end of the day, effective communication is fundamental. People frequently don't communicate enough, or they don't communicate in the way which, as you say, is reading the room or reading the body language. So I think you're right. Working in customer-facing environment, sales of any sort, it's a sound basis, probably for most careers, but HR, I would think, in particular, for people aspiring to that role, a bit of time in sales would not be a bad thing. I mean, you've already listed a number of great things that you've achieved, but looking back now over the past period of your career to date, what are the things that stand out for you that you feel have been probably the most satisfying achievements?
I think there are a couple of things that stand out. So when I worked at the Police Training Centre, there was a huge redeployment programme going on, and a number of the police officers who were seconded to do training were moving back to force, and it was a put back to force rather than a desire to. So I managed that process. I was temporarily promoted at the time at quite a young age in the civil service, and I managed that programme. And I received a letter from the Assistant Chief Constable, who was the head of Centrex at the time, handwritten, expressing his thanks to me, and I still have it. And it was a real proud moment that I'd stepped up, I could see what needed to be done, and I'd managed a programme of returning the officers back to force. And I think we will talk about reward, and we will talk about, in terms of that. But that was huge to me. It was huge that I received a handwritten note and somebody took that time to appreciate and give thanks. Over my time at the council, again, another change programme, we went through something called single status, where it was a change in terms and conditions. And we had many restructures. And again, managing those hard times, but still making people feel that they had a choice or they had some element of control, and managing each situation to that person's needs. So some people, where they go through change, they see it as a real opportunity, and I've managed to deal with people that they found it to be an opportunity, and they've gone off to do other things that have been supported through that change program. So I feel that the way of delivering HR, the way of being supportive, understanding and kind, I have tried to do that, and the outcomes I've often seen as positive. Another thing that stands out, and it's quite small, but I did I supported a disciplinary, and this is quite operational, but supported a disciplinary where unfortunately an individual was dismissed. But at the end of it, they shook my hand and thanked me for the support that they've received. And for me, it's not about the process. It really is around the delivery, the kindness, the support that you can go through while you're doing a process that isn't particularly positive. So I look back and there's been a number of things I'm proud of, but some of the things really stick in my mind, and I think there were a couple of them.
I think that's really great to be able to share that. When we think about management, managing people, I've always used a definition, a very simple one: getting things done through other people. And in a way, when you're working in the HR space, it's a further step removed. Because you're working through the line managers, so getting them, enabling, supporting them to get things done, to get people to do things. But you've usefully just juxtaposed that. There will be moments where you are the one that is interacting directly in even in very difficult circumstances. So yes, that nuanced approach to the role sounds as though it's a really important thing for people to think about.
I think so. I think, what if we think about the perception of HR, over the years, it's been very much that potentially HR sit in a room and are only used and needed when something's going on. And usually that something is negative. But actually, we do have that direct contact. We can have that direct contact. And what's really important is that we're seeing that HR professionals are there for the whole organisation rather than just a management resource. But you're right, part of it is and enabling them to have the skill set to talk about, well, how how does it feel to be on the receiving end? Let's think about that. What words will we use? What language must we use? Let's comply with our policies, but also consider the individual at the end of this. And I think that's been really important to me over the years.
I mean, it is quite a dilemma sometimes, I think, playing the HR role. There are some people who, as you say, simply see it as a tool of management, perhaps in more recent years, greater regulation and so on, conforming to a particular agenda. On the other hand, it was often thought of almost as though this was the employee champion, a bit like a trade union leader. And obviously, particularly when you're working in a unionized environment, then you have to build close working relationships with trade union officials, both lay reps as well as full-time officials, as well as managers, as well as members of staff. So we talk about hybrid working. I think the
Yes.
HR person works in a hybrid way in terms of how they have to comport themselves.
Absolutely. And prior to leaving my last organisation, I worked with union officials in terms of there was a bin strike, which was very, very high profile. And it's absolutely right. We have to deliver a message to certain audiences and maybe deliver it in different styles, in different ways, and understand what each part and each strand of the organization needs and wants. So I think it can be very complex, but it's all about understanding what the end result should be and then trying to mediate and talk to different people about how you get there.
Yes, yes. People listening to our conversation will often be individuals who are currently studying, want to achieve professional accreditation as HR people, as reward specialists maybe, and maybe also some of their tutors. In the book that this series complements, of course, we try to make clear what we mean by the various terms around compensation management or reward management or total rewards management in some of the more recent parlance. Do you think, though, because we've suggested to people, the strapline of the book is alternatives, different strategic choices, consequences, working those out, and contexts, and that you have to frame your terms within context. If you're thinking then about reward, would you say that there are particular ways we need even to define our terms for the public services? Or do you think we can simply apply generic understanding of what reward management is and means?
I think we can apply generic. However, we are constrained in some ways in public service, in public service spend. And I think we also really need to think about when we talk about public service, we're talking about public funds. So we need to be really careful on the optics and what message we're giving if we're saying our total reward includes X, Y, and Z. That could be perceived to be, why is that in there? When, in effect, that means it's being paid by the public. So I think in terms of perhaps our narrative around it, we have to be very specific in what we mean and why we have that in place, because we just need to think about what could that be perceived as by others.
Yeah, and therefore thinking about what is meant by effective reward management in a public services setting, and how it has an impact on the overall organizational performance, and particularly, as you say, how that is perceived to operate. We've seen among some pundits at the moment with changes in the political landscape around the way in which, well, that's it, people, the way they get paid in the public sector, that's insulating them. They've got their gold-plated pension schemes and, various other points of criticism, which that doesn't apply in the private sector. It's a defined contribution pension now rather than defined benefit. How do you think we should engage with that conversation? Not to dismiss any side of it, but just perhaps to build a bit greater understanding between managing reward in public services versus the private sector or the third sector, charities and so on. Do you have any reflections on that?
I think It's a difficult one because people will always feel a certain way, and that again, the perception will be that the pensions are great, and therefore it's an environment where it's easier than the private sector. But in reality, until eyes are drawn into what actually goes on, it's very difficult to make that judgment, and it's very difficult to say this isn't the case. So I think for us in public sector, we just need to continue to work as we do, offer the rewards that we can, and understand that people might think it's gold-plated pensions, but actually the context of the work that you're doing, the pay is quite often lower than private sector, not always, but the demands there are as great as in private sector. I think it's lack of understanding, which doesn't help in terms of that view. I think in terms of the reward, again, we go back to what does that look like? What do people feel is an appropriate reward? And we've seen, like you said, lots of other organisations who are striking to say we deserve more pay because they look at other sectors and say this isn't fair, we're getting minimal pay rises or none at all. And I think what's so important is that we don't lose sight of public sector offer statutory duties, and we have to continue to do them, and we have to reward because otherwise we won't be able to attract people in, and if we don't attract people in, we will not have those people in those roles to continue to do them.
Yeah, I think ambiguity plays a really important role in the public services. If you work for a private sector organisation, okay, I appreciate you've got to deal with regulation and everything else, but at the end of the day, it's for profit. You've got to look to the bottom line all the time. Even if you work in the third sector, if you're a charity, when you're raising funds, you're doing what your trustees require, you're then disseminating them. In the public services, there's a lot more ambiguity, and obviously that can have an effect on everything, but reward management, performance management too.
And also a lot of scrutiny and transparency. So there's a lot of scrutiny because people want to know what they're getting for paying for our public funds, but there's so much transparency. So what is known in the public sector quite often are pay scales, are the rewards that are in place, whereas the private sector tend to not perhaps be as transparent, and so you don't see it. So it's not there for a fair comparison.
Yeah, I mean that whole issue of pay transparency is actually going to be the subject of another rewarding conversation. Colleague called Rachel Gibbs, who works in the consulting space across the EU, and reward transparency is very much the essence of what they focus on. And you're right, particularly in the public services, that degree of scrutiny. I know that in the private sector, for example, corporate governance and executive pay, more scrutiny, looking at pay comparisons, ratios, so on and so forth. But it's the degree of drilling down in the public services that one has to address. So yeah, transparency. So we're back to communication again. Transparency for people to understand what they're getting, the value inherent in it, which may not be immediately, people may not be immediately aware of, but then also being able to defend that in terms of value for money for the people who ultimately are paying the bills.